In 1983, a scientist published a paper claiming that trees, under attack, send out chemical signals warning their neighbors of danger. The scientific community didn't just disagree. They mocked him publicly, in print, using the phrase "talking trees" as an insult. For years, his discovery was treated as a punchline. Decades later, using tools he never had access to, scientists proved he was right all along. The scientist is Jack Schultz, working at Dartmouth College alongside an undergraduate student named Baldwin. In 1983, they ran an experiment that sounds almost too simple to matter. They took poplar and sugar maple saplings, deliberately damaged the leaves on some of them, the way an insect chewing through foliage would, and placed undamaged saplings nearby in the same growth chamber. What they found should have been unremarkable. Instead, it detonated. The undamaged trees, the ones nobody had touched, began producing defensive chemicals, the same anti-herbivore compounds you'd expect from a plant actively being eaten. But nothing was eating them. Schultz and Baldwin's explanation was straightforward: the damaged trees released airborne chemical compounds, and the nearby undamaged trees detected those compounds and responded by ramping up their own defenses, before any insect ever touched them. In their paper, published in the journal Science, they called it communication between plants. That single word choice, communication, is what set off the firestorm. The public loved it immediately. Scientists did not. Newspapers ran with it. The idea of talking trees was irresistible. A story about secret plant language spread through the popular press almost overnight. But inside the scientific community, that same popularity became a liability. Plant biologists at the time built their entire understanding of plants around one core assumption: plants are passive. They don't send signals. They don't warn each other. They photosynthesize, they grow, and that's it. A paper claiming otherwise, especially one that had been picked up gleefully by tabloids, looked to many scientists less like rigorous research and more like something that belonged in a supermarket checkout magazine. Critics accused Schultz and Baldwin of sloppy methodology, of overinterpreting a fluke result, of confusing correlation with an almost science fiction conclusion. Other researchers tried to replicate the experiment and got messy, inconsistent results. Some found nothing at all. A wave of skeptical commentary followed, some of it openly dismissive, treating the entire idea of plant-to-plant signaling as more fantasy than field. For years, plant communication wasn't just an unproven idea in ecology. It was closer to a cautionary tale, the kind of finding you'd cite as an example of getting ahead of your data. Here's what actually made the early experiments so fragile: the technology to detect what plants were emitting was primitive. Researchers were trying to measure faint, complex mixtures of airborne chemical compounds using instruments that weren't remotely sensitive enough for the job. That meant results were inconsistent, not necessarily because the phenomenon wasn't real, but because the tools available in 1983 often weren't good enough to reliably see it. It would take a completely different scientific era to fix that problem. Starting in the 2000s and accelerating through the 2010s, a new generation of chemical analysis tools changed everything. Scientists gained access to far more sensitive instruments capable of detecting and identifying the full mixture of volatile compounds a plant releases into the air, sometimes called its volatilome. With these tools, researchers like Richard Carbon at UC Davis began systematically documenting what earlier studies could only gesture at: sagebrush plants that had been clipped or damaged reliably triggered chemical defense responses in nearby, undamaged sagebrush, and the effect held up under much more rigorous testing than had been possible decades earlier. Around the same time, plant scientist Ted Farmer discovered something even stranger: some plants don't just use airborne chemicals to signal danger. They use electrical pulses, propagating through the plant almost like a nervous system, a wave of voltage change racing outward from the site of an injury. Piece by piece, the field that had once been treated as a punchline was rebuilt on much sturdier evidence. Today, plant volatile signaling isn't a fringe theory. It's a documented, actively studied area of plant biology, one Schultz himself continued working on for decades, refining the original discovery rather than being pushed out of the field. Researchers now understand that when a plant is damaged, whether by an insect, a fungus, or physical injury, it can release a specific chemical blend into the air. Nearby plants that detect that blend don't develop full defenses instantly. Instead, many prime themselves, essentially loading their defenses halfway, so that if an attack does reach them, they can respond faster and stronger than they otherwise would have. Scientists are now finding practical uses for all of this. Some agricultural researchers are exploring sentinel plants and volatile monitoring systems designed to detect crop damage or even biological threats early, essentially listening for a plant's chemical alarm signal before a human would ever notice a problem. Which brings us to a much bigger, much stranger question than the original experiment ever asked. None of this means plants are thinking, or intending, or warning each other the way a person might shout to a neighbor. Plants don't have brains or nervous systems in the way animals do. What they clearly do have is an extraordinarily sophisticated, chemical-driven response system, one that reacts to environmental information and changes behavior in ways that, from the outside, look uncannily like communication. That's forced scientists into an uncomfortable but genuinely interesting debate: how much of what we call intelligence actually requires a brain at all? A plant with no nervous system can detect danger to its neighbor and adjust its own chemistry in advance. Whether you call that communication, signaling, or something we don't have a good word for yet, it's forced an entire field to rethink what a plant actually is. Jack Schultz's 1983 discovery wasn't wrong. It was early, published before the tools existed to properly confirm it, at a moment when the entire scientific culture around plants wasn't ready to take the idea seriously. The ridicule wasn't really a referendum on the truth. It was a reflection of how unprepared plant biology was, in 1983, for the possibility that plants might be doing something this sophisticated. For decades of better instruments and more careful research did what the original paper alone couldn't. They proved the core idea was right all along. If a story like this changes how you look at the plants in your own backyard, that's exactly the reaction it should get. Subscribe if you want more stories about the ideas science mocked before it eventually proved them right. And tell me in the comments, what other ridiculed scientific discovery should I dig into next?